Feel the neon pulse of a world where every flickering light represents a choice, a chance, or a secret. We capture the high-stakes drama of the streets through a cinematic lens of glowing colors and deep shadows. Subscribe today and keep your finger on the pulse of the night. My brother's rehearsal dinner was supposed to be the happiest night of the year. Instead, my father stood at the head of the table, raised his glass toward my brother and his fiancée, and then looked directly at me and said, "And what about you? Still playing house with that handyman of yours?" 50 people heard that. My brother's future in-laws, the caterers, my aunt, who'd flown in from Phoenix. Every single person at that long, flower-covered table went quiet, and I sat there with my fork in my hand and said nothing. Because I knew something my father didn't. And when my boyfriend stood up 20 minutes later, and my brother's future father-in-law grabbed the table like his knees might give out and said, "Wait, you're the one who built the Caldwell Center?" That silence came back. But it felt completely different the second time. I need to start at the beginning. My name is Sable. I'm 31 years old and I'm an elementary school teacher. I teach second grade at a public school in a part of town that doesn't get a lot of resources, and I love my job in the specific, exhausting, irreplaceable way that people love things that cost them something. I drive a 7-year-old Subaru. I rent a 2-bedroom apartment. I don't own stock in anything. I am, by my family's measurement, the one who didn't quite make it. My brother Finn is a corporate attorney. He's 34. He passed the bar on his first try and joined a firm that has its name on a building downtown. And every time my parents mention him at a dinner party, they say his full name, first and last, like he's a public figure, like you might have heard of him. I'm just Sable. My parents, my father especially, build their identity around professional status, the way some families build it around religion. My father is a retired judge. My mother spent her career as a hospital administrator. Their friends are doctors and partners at law firms, and people who sit on nonprofit boards that sound impressive when you say them out loud. Growing up, the question at every family dinner wasn't, "Are you happy?" or "Do you have enough?" It was, "What are your plans?" And the plans that counted had corner offices attached to them. I chose teaching anyway. I chose it because I remembered my own second-grade teacher, Mrs. Aldridge, who taped a note to my desk on the day I read my first full chapter book that said, "You did it." 2 words. I never forgot them. I wanted to be someone who did that for other kids. My parents came to my college graduation with the expressions of people attending a funeral for something they'd hoped would turn out differently. They weren't cruel about it, not exactly. They were quiet about it in a way that communicated everything. My father paid for my teaching credential classes without complaint and said, "Well, at least it's stable." That was the best he could do. Then I met Knox. I met him at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning in October, about 3 years ago. I was buying bread. He was at the next booth over, talking to the vendor about soil drainage like it was the most interesting conversation he'd ever had. He had paint on his forearm and a measuring tape clipped to his belt, and he looked at me when I laughed at something the bread vendor said. And he smiled like we were already friends. We talked for 40 minutes. I missed buying the bread entirely. Knox is a builder. That's how he described himself when I asked. And I liked that he said it that way. So simple and accurate. He builds things. He started when he was 19, working construction summers to pay for community college. And somewhere in his mid-20s, he started taking on renovation projects of his own. And then restoration work. And then something shifted. He got a commission to restore a historic school building in a rural county that had been closed for 15 years. He did it almost entirely himself, sourcing original materials, learning techniques he'd never used before, finishing 6 weeks ahead of schedule and under budget. The county school board cried at the ribbon cutting. He told me that story on our 3rd date like it was just something that had happened, not like it was the most remarkable thing I'd ever heard. I never asked Knox about money. It didn't occur to me to ask. And even if it had, I wouldn't have known the right questions. He lived simply. He drove a truck that was older than mine. He cooked dinner more often than I did, and he was better at it. He wore the same canvas jacket for 2 years, until a sleeve started fraying and I finally threw it away when he wasn't looking. I knew he owned land. He mentioned it sometimes acreage in the eastern part of the state that he'd bought slowly, parcel by parcel, over about 8 years. He talked about it the way he talked about most things, practically without performance. What I didn't know what he never led with, never mentioned in a way that felt like it was supposed to impress me, was the scope of what he'd built. Not just houses. Community centers. Libraries in underserved counties. A vocational training facility attached to a juvenile rehabilitation program that a nonprofit foundation had funded. His name was on grants. His work had been written up in 2 architecture journals. He had turned down a development contract worth more than I will earn in a decade because he didn't like what they were planning to do with the land. He didn't tell me any of this, not because he was hiding it, because it didn't come up naturally, and because Knox is constitutionally incapable of bragging. I found out slowly, the way you find things out about people you're actually paying attention to. A framed letter on his office wall from a county commissioner. A phone call I half heard where he said, "Tell them the foundation will cover the shortfall." A name I saw on a building plaque when he drove me through a small town 40 minutes outside the city. A building I later realized he had designed and constructed himself. By the time of my brother's rehearsal dinner, I knew who Knox was. I just hadn't announced it to my family, because Knox had never asked me to, and because a part of me, honestly, wanted to keep him separate from all of that. From the measuring, from the comparisons, from my father's voice doing that particular calculation. My brother Finn got engaged to a woman named Prue 8 months ago. Prue is lovely, genuinely lovely. The kind of person who remembers what you ordered the last time you were at a restaurant together and asks if you want to try something different this time. Her family is from Asheville. Her father, a man named Desmond, runs a nonprofit that builds affordable housing across 5 states. Her mother teaches at a university. They are warm and unpretentious, and I liked them immediately when I met them at Thanksgiving. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant my parents had reserved for the occasion. Long tables, low lighting, flowers that must have cost more than my car payment. 60 people. The whole family. Both sides. Knox wore a blue button-down shirt. He looked exactly like himself. He shook hands with everyone, asked my aunt about her garden because she'd mentioned it to me once, and I'd told him. Remembered the name of Finn's college roommate from something I'd said 6 months ago. That's who he is. That's how he moves through a room. My father found him within the first 15 minutes. I watched it happen from across the room. My father has a way of asking questions that sounds polite but functions as an audit. He did it to Knox with a glass of wine in his hand and his jacket buttoned, and Knox answered everything directly and without apology. What do you do? I build. What kind of building? Construction, restoration, some community development work. Do you work for a firm? No. I run my own operation. How many people depends on the project? Right now, about 40. My father nodded in the way he nods when he's decided something. At dinner, I was seated 4 places down from Knox, beside my mother and my cousin Hartley, who had driven up from Savannah. The seating arrangement was my mother's doing. I don't think it was intentional. I think she just didn't think about it. My father stood for a toast before the appetizers arrived. He spoke about Ben beautifully, actually. He talked about watching him study for the bar, about the phone call when the results came in, about being proud in the way that takes you by surprise, the kind that sits in your chest for days. Prue's parents were nodding and smiling. Prue was crying a little, the good kind. Then my father looked down the table at me.
He raised his glass slightly in my direction, and he smiled. And he said, "And Sable, we're always happy to have you here too. Even if you're still saving the world one crayon drawing at a time." People laughed. Not meanly, most of them nervous, polite, the way people laugh when they don't know what else to do. My mother touched her napkin. Hartley looked at her plate. My father added, looking at Prue's parents now. "She teaches second grade. Very noble. And her boyfriend builds things." So between the two of them, he made a little balancing gesture with his hand. "They've got a very colorful life." Desmond, Prue's father, was looking at Knox. I didn't see it at first. I was focused on keeping my expression neutral, on not letting the thing that was happening to my face reach my eyes. I'd had practice, but I heard Desmond say something quietly to his wife, Miriam, and I looked up, and Desmond was still looking at Knox, and his expression was not the polite dinner table expression it had been 30 seconds ago. It was recognition. Knox had noticed. He caught Desmond's eye across the table, and something passed between them. Not dramatic, just a small acknowledgement. Like two people in a crowd who realize they've met before. Desmond set down his fork. "I'm sorry," he said. And his voice was calm, but it carried, "I don't want to interrupt, but..." He looked at Knox. "You're the one who did the Caldwell Center build in Rutherford County." Knox said yes. Desmond turned to my father. "Do you know what that project was?" He didn't say it with any heat. He said it the way someone says something when they genuinely cannot believe the other person is missing the information. "That building is the reason we were able to secure federal funding for 3 additional sites. I've been trying to find out who was responsible for it for 8 months. We had a dinner, our board, regional partners, we gave an award to the project, and couldn't reach the contractor." There was a pause. My father said, "Oh." Desmond stood up. Not quite all the way, just enough to reach across the table, and he shook Knox's hand. "I'd really like to talk to you after dinner," he said. "If you're willing." Knox said he'd be glad to. The rest of the dinner felt different. I couldn't tell you exactly what changed. Nobody announced anything. Nobody made a speech. But I noticed that my father's end of the table got quieter, and Desmond and Miriam kept looking at Knox with the kind of attention that meant they were reassessing everything they'd understood about the room. Finn, my brother, who is not a bad person, who has just spent his whole life swimming in the current our parents created, leaned over at one point and said quietly to me, "I didn't know Knox did that kind of work." "He doesn't really lead with it," I said. After dinner, while people were moving to the bar area, I found my way to Knox and stood beside him. Desmond was already there, and Miriam, and 2 other people from Prue's family who had overheard the earlier exchange. Desmond was asking Knox about the vocational center, the one attached to the juvenile rehabilitation program. He had apparently toured it without knowing who built it. He had apparently called it, in a report, the most thoughtfully designed rehabilitation-adjacent facility I've seen in 20 years of this work. Knox listened. He asked questions back. He was not performing anything. I watched my father approach from the side. He came to stand near the edge of the conversation, and I saw him listening. And I watched something move across his face that I didn't have an exact word for. Not shame, exactly. Something quieter and more complicated. Something that looked like a man realizing he had done his measuring with the wrong instrument. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there for a moment. And then he touched my shoulder, lightly as he passed. It wasn't an apology, not yet. But it was something. The drive home was quiet for the first few miles. Knox was the one who broke it. He said, "You okay?" "You never told me about the Caldwell Center," I said. He thought about that. "I told you I did a school restoration in Rutherford County. You didn't tell me it was the reason a non-profit could fund 3 more projects." He looked at the road. I didn't know that part until just now, actually. I believed him. That's the thing about Knox. He finishes the work and moves to the next thing. He doesn't stay to watch what the work does after he leaves. My dad said something ugly tonight, I said. I know. It bothered me more than I wanted it to. Of course it did, he said. He's your dad. We didn't talk about it more than that night. Some things don't need to be solved immediately. Sometimes you just have to let them sit in the car with you for a while. My father called me 3 days later. He asked if he could come by. He drove to my apartment on a Tuesday afternoon and sat at my kitchen table, and he didn't look like a retired judge. He looked like a man who had spent a few days thinking about something he would have preferred not to think about. He said, I want to talk about what I said at the dinner. I let him talk. He didn't make excuses, which surprised me. He said that he had spent his whole career believing that a specific kind of achievement looked a specific kind of a way, and that he had applied that to me and to the people in my life in a way that was unkind. He said the word unkind. It was a word I had not heard him use about himself before. He said he had looked up Knox after the dinner. He named 3 projects. He said, I didn't know. You didn't ask, I said. He nodded. I didn't ask. That's not a full repair. I want to be honest about that. One conversation at a kitchen table doesn't undo 31 years of being measured and found lacking. It doesn't unknow the way I've learned to brace myself every time my family has a gathering. The way I prepare a kind of armor before I walk in. Those things are still there. But my father sat at my table and said he'd been wrong, and he meant it, and that's more than I'd ever expected him to give. Knox came by later that evening. He brought food from a Thai place we both like, and we sat on my couch and he asked how it went. I told him. He said, How do you feel? I thought about it, like something shifted. I don't know if it shifted enough. He nodded. He didn't try to fix it or reframe it or tell me I should feel good about it. He just passed me the container of curry and turned on the television, and we sat there together, and that was enough for that night. My father and I are not repaired. We are in the process of something that doesn't have a clean name. He has called twice since that Tuesday. He asked me, last week, to tell him more about my students. Not politely, not the way he asks about things he's already decided don't matter. He asked like he actually wanted to know. I told him about a kid in my class who spent the first 3 months of the year refusing to read aloud, and last week raised her hand and read a full paragraph without stopping, and the look on her face after. I told him that story and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, That sounds important. It is, I told him. It really is. As for Knox, we are still us. He is still the person who shows up with dinner when I've had a hard week, who knows the name of every kid I've told him about, who finished a project last month in a county 2 hours away that he will probably never mention, unless someone else brings it up first. I don't need my family to approve of my life to know it's a good one. But I'll admit that it matters. Somewhere in a place I don't always have access to, that my father sat at my table and looked at me differently than he ever had before. Sometimes, that's how things change. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic moment. Just a small shift in how someone holds their eyes when they look at you. And the long, quiet work of figuring out what to do with that. I keep thinking about the moment Desmond grabbed the edge of that table. Not the toast. Not what my father said into a room full of 60 people about crayons and colorful lives. Not even Knox's face when Desmond shook his hand. I keep coming back to that one small physical detail. A man's hand steadying himself because something he thought he understood had just shifted under him. That's what the truth does sometimes. It doesn't announce itself. It just arrives, and suddenly the ground is different, and everyone in the room has to find their footing again. I've thought a lot about what made that night possible. Not the karma piece. I know that's what people want to call it, and I understand the appeal. But I don't think the universe was keeping score. I think something more ordinary happened, and more instructive. Knox spent 8 years building things that mattered in places that didn't get enough attention. He did it without telling people who he was. He did it because the work itself was the point. That kind of integrity, the kind that functions the same whether or not anyone is watching, has a way of compounding. Not always in a single dramatic dinner, but over time, the things you build in honesty have a longer reach than the things you build for applause. And I stayed. That's the part I want to say something about because I think it's easy to miss. I stayed in my classroom for 6 years while my family perfected the art of not asking about it. I drove my 7-year-old car and signed my lease and showed up every September for kids who needed someone to show up. I didn't do it to make a point. I did it because I understood, in some way I couldn't always articulate at a family dinner, that the value of a thing is not located in how impressively you can describe it to a retired judge. The girl in my class who read her paragraph out loud for the first time last week, that happened because I was still there. That's the compound interest of persistence. It doesn't show up on her resume, it shows up in a child's face. My father thought he knew how to measure a life. He'd spent 40 years as a judge, a man whose whole professional identity was organized around evaluation and verdict. Of course, that's how he moved through family dinners. But the instrument he was using was too narrow. It could measure income and title. It couldn't measure what Knox left behind in Rutherford County. It couldn't measure what I leave behind in room 14 every June. What I've learned, slowly, imperfectly, with a lot of Tuesday evenings sitting with things I'd rather not sit with, is that a clear sense of your own values is not the same as arrogance. Knowing what your work means, even when the people at the table don't, is not delusion. It's a kind of quiet intelligence that takes years to develop and is very easy for other people to confuse with underachievement. My father sat at my kitchen table and said he'd been wrong. That took something from him. I don't minimize it. It is genuinely hard to revise a belief that has organized your life for 4 decades, and he did it anyway, and that matters. But I didn't need his revision to know my life was worth living. I knew that already. That's the thing I most want to hold on to. Not the dinner, not the moment Desmond stood up, not the expression on my father's face when he realized what he'd dismissed. Just the fact that I already knew, before any of it was confirmed by someone else's recognition. That's the only kind of knowing that's actually yours.